In this lecture, we're going to look at Murray Bookchin's theory of social ecology. We Bookchin is an American anarchist and philosopher. So his contributions, in some sense, is pretty immense in the field of how he tries to use the very notion of the post-Marxist critical social theory. Now, if we look at the background of how this very theory of social ecology emerges, now there is this few section of elite class who actually engage in trying to control, to manipulate the natural resources for their own individual interests and benefits. However, but at a very substantial cost of the environment, and again for the disadvantaged social group or those who are perceived to be the marginalized. So therefore there has been a constant conflict and tussle between environment and development. So industrialization was also presumed to be one of the most cause for ecological degradation. Now, Murray Bookchin, as I had pointed out, has come up with this theory of social ecology in his book, which was published way back in 1964 in Ecology and Revolutionary Thought. So, if you look at the works of Murray Bookchin, it has in some sense stimulated a wide ranging debates over the past few decades, from environmental ethics to debates in the democratic and the utopian theory, and from concerns about the future of libertarian thought, and to the debates about the ecological thought and feminism. Now, Bookchin in some sense has pioneered a form of urban ecological critique that reoriented critical social theory to place at the center stage the reified and dehumanized forms of modern urbanism, and also the environmentally hazardous dynamics of grow or die. So in some sense it tries to look at the way in which how there is this notion of hierarchy, domination and nature, and how the domination, which is pretty much social in nature among human beings, is in some sense responsible for the kind of domination which is caused to human being. So as I had pointed out, the most of the work of Murray Bookchin stands as one of the most ambitious attempts in the recent times to produce a post-Marxist social theory, and that in some sense places ecological concerns at its core. So we'll be looking at some of the very ideas of how social ecology actually move on to look at what are the kind of conflicts and contestations which emerges. Now, social ecology again is the study of how individuals interact and respond to the environment around them, and how these interactions affect society and the environment as a whole. Now, this social ecology approach again is it sort of tries to embraces an ecological reconstructive and communication view on society. So this theory or ideology in some sense looks to reconstruct and transform the current outlooks on both social issues and also the environmental factors, while promoting some sort of direct participations of people concerning the environment. So books in social ecology in some sense proposes a kind of ethical principles for replacing society propensity for hierarchy and domination with that of democracy, so to say, and freedom. So he wrote about the effects of urbanization on human life in the early 1960s, during when he himself was pretty much engaged and actively involved in the civil rights and related social movement. So one can actually say that Bookchin was a leading theoretical progenitor of the many currents of left ecological thought and action which emerges way back in the 1960s. And no doubt his magnum opus, that is the Ecology of Freedom, was actually one of the seminal contributions of Bookchin with regards to social ecology and movement. And to his credit, Bookchin has authored more than 220 books, and also countless articles and pamphlets, and which in some sense try to seek to offer a coherent theoretical underpinning of the work of generations pertaining to the ecological and anti-authoritarian activist. Now, how does one engage and try to delve into looking at social ecology? As I had already pointed out, some of the background of how this theory of social ecology emerges, and also how Bookchin in some sense, the kind of contributions and affiliations which he has, and he himself being deeply engaged in civil rights and movement. So there is this notions of the Western ideology which we have partly familiarized ourselves by now from the earlier lectures, that the very notions of dominations of nature or the natural world in some sense has arises from the way in which how we as a human shared relations amongst ourselves. Now, if you look at the quote which I have highlighted out here from Bookchin's work from the Ecology of Freedom, that the dominations of man stems from the very real dominations of human by human. So therefore, in some sense, this reflect the notion that how the dominations of nature actually stems from the dominations of human by human. So therefore, these notions of hierarchy and domination actually has emerged from the social institutions or the social relationships, so to say. Now, what then does this theory tries to posit, and then what is the main objective of the undercurrent notion of principles of social ecology? It in some sense tries to aims and try to replace our mentality of domination with an ethics of complementarity. So what is this ethics of complementary then? Such ethics in some sense reflects that all the true role which is to create a fuller, richer world for all beings. That includes not just necessarily human but also even the non-human world. So these ideas or this ethics of complementarity has a spiritual dimension which is been embedded in it, and which of course is being addressed by many of the social ecologists as respiritization of the natural world. But so in some sense it is trying to give a new impetus or a new or energize the natural world, or maybe a deep sense of reverence, which of course belongs to the primal religion. So therefore, this necessity of changing, the perceptions and traditions of how do we actually deal with the natural surroundings around us. So therefore, this idea of this spirituality or spiritual dimensions, which is posited by the social ecologists, is in some sense pretty much guided by this idea of naturalism or naturalistic, rather than the supernaturalistic, or what we understood as the pantheistic. So therefore, the way in which how social ecology in some way tries to provide an alternative, which is based on the idea of a society which is actually again based on the ecological principles, that is which profess the idea of an organic unity in diversity. Though we as a human species and non-human species have positions ourselves differently, and we have this diverse functions or the way in which we evolve, but there is this deep sense of unity in diversity, and of course which does not have this hierarchy that human is above nature, or maybe even the notion of these anthropocentric ideas has to be in some way removed. Rather, it should be replaced by this idea of biocentric and ecocentric. So therefore, it will in some sense enhance a kind of a mutual and interrelationship of all aspects of life. So therefore, social ecology in some way tries to address and bring out or churn out a kind of holistic, and where every individual in some way, or every species for that matter, can in some sense assert their place and rights. So therefore, this notion of this democracy and freedom is something which is pretty much innate in the social ecological principles. So if we go back looking at how this ecological crisis emerges, is partly because the way we as a human tends to look or deals with each other, that is for example, we often say that the capitalist society is pretty much exploitative in nature, because we enter into certain kinds of relations pertaining to production, and then there is this notion of like the owner and the workers, and and partly because the have and the have not. So therefore, there is this hierarchy of people in terms of access to resources, or accumulation of wealth, or sense of ownership and property. So therefore, in the way in which we human deal with is pretty much guided by this idea of like hierarchy. So therefore, we as a human being, in some sense, the way we deal as a social beings is pretty much crucial, or a reflections of the social being is pretty much important in order to locate or contextualize this notion of ecological crisis, because the ecological crisis is not something which is isolated from the human society, but it in some sense has its emerges from within. So therefore, if we are in a way able to that this change within ourselves, that is the human society, in terms of our relationship with the rest of nature, will actually be automatically changed or transformed. So therefore, to separate the ecological problems with that of the social would be actually something which we would be missing out many points. So therefore it is utmost importance for us to address the social problems which we have encountered or are into it alongside the ecological problems which we have faced. So therefore there is these two issues are actually have to be addressed parallelly. So some of the key principles which is being highlighted with respect to this idea of or theory of social ecology is that ecological crisis which we as a human encounter in the past few decades actually arises from the deep-seated social problems. So therefore ecological problems cannot be really solved or can addressed or resolved without really addressing the issue of social or societal problems. And on the other hand, it is also important, one very important point which is being highlighted in the context of what we are discussing is that the social hierarchy and class actually in some way legitimizes our domination of the environment, and that actually underpins the consumer system. So our society actually is pretty much being influenced by this notion of the market or consumerism, and there is cutthroat competition among individuals in different sections of society or cultural group. So therefore there is this notion of survival of the fittest, or maybe the idea of grow or die, that is, if I am able to achieve something, that I'm least bothered about the other individuals. So therefore this sense of individualism, or maybe the or we would say that from the psychological point of view, this narcissistic behavior which we as a human suffer from, in some sense pose a kind of problem not just to us or among humans, but also the overall environment or natural surrounding which we are into. So therefore the root cause of environmental problems are in some sense issues like the trade for profit, or maybe in terms of looking at the resources from utilitarian or from commodified or commodifications of resources. So therefore the industrial expansions and the identifications of progress with corporate with self-interest are some of the issues which is highlighted by Bookchin in his explanations addressing what social ecology is. So therefore social ecology in some way tries to look at that way in which the future of human society or human life actually should parallelly go alongside with the prosperity of the natural or non-human world. So therefore we can't afford to really brush aside the non-human world and be obsessed about just the human life or human beings. So therefore there is this very notions of ethics of this complementarity which needs to evolve, and that would perhaps sets a different kinds of an alternative or a brighter destiny for human life. So therefore social ecologists believe that things like these problems of racism, sexism, and third world exploitations are actually the byproduct or the product of the same mechanism that cause different kinds of environmental problems, such as the rainforest devastation. So therefore Bookchin made an attempt in his theory and posited the idea that he calls for a holistic ecological sensibility, okay, that would in some way tries to encourage or play and celebrate kind of imagination. So Bookchin also in some sense claims that most environmentalists actually focus on the symptoms of our problems rather than the causes. So by merely trying to addressing the issue of symptoms would tantamount to like following a shallow ecological approach, wherein pollution is actually being addressed for the simple reason that it causes a kind of like health issues to those the advanced or the elitist category or group of society. So therefore, it is important that to address the causes, not just simply the symptoms. So therefore, one has to go at the the grassroots level and tries to address the issue at the very bottom. So the second point which we can actually look at is that if we are to actually change or bring a kind of revolution in the society, is that the way in which how these soft technologies are not actually going to make any kind of difference, because simple technology can still be pretty much creating a havoc, that is it can cause a kind of environmental damage. For instance, the forests of England were actually being cut down with the use of simple axes, and then that has not really changed since the Bronze Age. So therefore, we cannot really afford to blame that heavy machines is actually responsible for this environmental damage. So rather, it has more to do with the kind of attitudes or the way in which how we relate with the natural world. So most of today's environmentalism is merely based on this idea of environmental engineering, that is pretty much guided or consigned with the notion of tinkering with the existing institutions and of course values than literally changing them. So therefore, environmentalism is used to win large constituencies, but not to educate them. So books in some way has tries to highlight this very timely and problematic issues which we have encountered as a human society. Now, if you look at the relationship between human and nature, and of course by now we have in some sense familiarized ourselves with how or how intimately humans share a relationship with nature, but which is of course different from Western scientific traditions of how nature is being perceived. So therefore, if we go back to the idea of what Darwin has actually posited, that is the struggle for existence, or maybe the notions of this survival of the fittest. So these are some of the popular terms or terminologies which are being posited by Darwin, and this actually tries to address or explains why there is an increasingly subjective and flexible, more flexible beings are capable of dealing with the environmental changes and more effectively than are less subjective and flexible beings. Now, conceiving this non-human nature as its own evolution rather than as a mere vista has in some sense a profound implications, that is which is ethical as well as biological, that is for the ecologically minded people. Now, what does Bookchin has tries to argue in these connections? So Bookchin's emphasize that human beings are basically not just a highly intelligent primates. Rather, we are pretty much part of that, which we are actually a special case and superficial and potentially misanthropic. So Bookchin again continues to say that to depict human being as aliens that have no place or maybe a pedigree in natural evolution, or to see them as essentially as an infestation that parasitizes a highly anthropomorphic version of the planet, that is the Gaia, the way fleas parasitize dogs and cats, is bad thinking and not only bad ecology. So therefore, this notion of this ethics, that is, which is perceived to be morally right or wrong, is something which we need to look at. Now, how does we as a human really engage or become part of the evolutionary process? Now, humans again are in some sense an expressions of a deep natural process, and to Bookchin, human consciousness is a result of nature striving for increasing complexity and awareness. So therefore, humans are actually nature that has become self-aware, which have that consciousness. So we are pretty much part of the evolutionary process, and for that matter the biological evolution, which Bookchin calls the first nature, but also have a unique social awareness, which he calls the second nature. So the moment we become as a human, that is right from our birth and then which we grew up. So the moment we first evolve is the first nature, and then once we have become socialized, beginning from our infant childhood and so on and so forth, we have that sense of social awareness, and that this is what Bookchin call as the second nature. Therefore, our second nature, that is the development of technology, science, social institutions, towns and cities, are all actually dependent on human abilities that evolve from the first nature. So we have that kind of awareness, thinking, imaginations, which are framed by the kind of environment which we are exposed to. For example, the social institutions, or maybe the use of science, technology, so on and so forth. So it sort of engages in trying to shaping our second nature. Now, how does this problem emerges from our beings of this second nature is that the ideologies they produce, that is the extent to which they contribute to the biotic evolution or maybe abort it, and the damage which we, a human society, inflicted to the earth or the planet as a whole, lie at the very heart of the modern ecological crisis. So therefore, Bookchin in some sense tries to reject the idea of either or thinking behind the notion of these commonly hailed opposites, anthropocentricity and biocentricity. So this opposing principle, that is biocentricity, claims that all beings have equal intrinsic value, and actually it is bound up with the notion of this biocentric democracy, which Bookchin describe as almost, which is meaningless. So therefore, social ecology integrates, that is the first, that is the biotic nature which we as a human has, with the second, that is the human nature. So therefore, human society and non-human nature are pretty much interconnected or related in terms of how the evolutionary flow engages with. Now, how do we then engage in trying to give an interpretative meaning to the social issues which we as a humans are pretty much being part of it, so systematically arranged, and we actually should know that how each idea actually derive from others and is part of an overall like evolutions or developments. So there is this notion of this, how these decentralizations actually played out here. So therefore, social ecology in some sense calls upon us to see that nature and society are interlinked by evolution. That is, into one nature that consists of two differentiation, that is the first or the biotic and the second or the human nature. So human nature and biotic nature share and evolutionary potential for a greater subjectivity and flexibility. And secondly, the second nature is the way in which human beings are pretty much wanting to change, and then there is this notion of this flexibility. So that is to say that people in some way create an environment that is most suitable for their mode of existence, and we as a human have is equipped with that adaptive mechanism, that is how we adjust and appropriate nature, or maybe in terms of how we shape or change the environment according to our suitability and our want. Now, what are the kind of the impact which we as a human have on the environment, and what are the kind of environmental changes which have which is being produced by the human? Now, as we all know, like the past few centuries or maybe in successive generations, humans have act upon the environment, that is enter into relationship with nature, maybe in terms of production for our whether may it be for our subsistence, means of lives or livelihoods, or maybe for appropriating nature for the terms of profit, so on and so forth. So therefore, we as a human have considerably engaged with the environment with a kind of with the use of the enhancements of technology and so on and so forth. So therefore, one has to really look into these aspects from the ecological vantage point of view. So therefore, humans have their culture, which are of course rich in knowledge, experience, cooperations, and which are very much concerned with the conceptual intellectuality. However, the problem is that they may be sharply divided against themselves at certain points of their development. That is the kind of conflict which we usually engage upon between different groups, classes, nation states, and even city states. So therefore, this notion of this hierarchy is pretty much visible in the human world. So the non-human beings generally live in a kind of topographical ecological needs, and their behavior are actually being conditioned primarily by instinctive drives and conditions by reflexes, unlike human being, because humans uh, are not simply conscious about what they have to do. So there is this notion of social awareness, and our thinking and imaginations and are being conditioned by the society which we, or social groups which we are exposed to. Therefore, human societies are actually bonded together by institutions that changes radically over the successive centuries. And non-human communities are actually notable for their fixity in general terms, or maybe by clearly preset or often genetically imprinted rhythms. So human communities, on the other hand, are again guided in part by the ideological factors. So the ideological factors may not necessarily be of the individual, but it could be by the ruling class, and are subject to change, which are conditioned by those factors. How then does the notion of this domination emerges, and then how does it really took shape and then origined? Now the social eventually, which is premise or structure around these status groups, for example the kind of class formations which we have, which I have already outlined about, the have and the have nots, and the superior, the inferior, this sort of like class formations, and the way in which how we are exposed to the social and the cultural phenomena, actually does this emerges from the biological, or maybe we can say from our first nature. So biological facts such as lineage, gender distributions, and age differences were actually slowly institutionalized, and at the same time we as members of the society have literally and bit by bit we are being made aware about this. And therefore this notion of how the lineage and social institutions have become institutionalized, and which partly have become a uniquely social dimension, which needs to be critically considered and looked into. So therefore the later states, this sort of institutions become an oppressive, hierarchical, and then there is this emergence of an exploitative class. So the social institutions which we as a human shape up and then grew up were slowly reworked at various periods and in various degrees into a rigid hierarchical structure which are based on command and obedience. So there is this notions of authoritarianism, and then how a few sections of the society are actually trying to control and give a kind of dictate the larger group. So therefore hierarchy in its earliest forms was probably not really marked by the rigid or harsh qualities it has acquired over history. Rather, if you look at the way in which many of the indigenous or the tribal communities, that notion of this gerontocracies, where age actually becomes a factor, and those the senior members or those the aged actually occupies the top rank in the hierarchy. So there is also this notion of how social dominations, which more or less originated with human males, by dominating the females. So and with the shift in technology, that is the cattle drawn plow agriculture, the male actually engaged into invading the horticultural sphere of the woman, who had actually used the simple digging sticks. That is, this notion of this egalitarian or egalitarianism is being attacked and disrupted, with the emergence or the evolution of this technology. and therefore their economic predominance in the community's life is pretty much diluted. So therefore male dominance becomes extremely active and ultimately yields a world that is managed by the male elites who dominated not only women but also other men. So there's this notion of like how people who are capable or maybe who are able to accrue more wealth in some way has shown a kind of dominance over the other humans. So then how does this dominations lead to a kind of hierarchy? So why hierarchy emerges is pretty much transparent enough, or it is pretty much visible. That is the informatives of age, the increasing populations, the inherent, the natural disasters, and the technological changes which is being witnessed, and that have actually in some way or the other privilege the male activities, for example, of engaging in hunting and caring for animals over the horticultural functions of the females, and the growth of a civil society and the spread of warfare. So this idea of dominating nature, that is nature in the broad sense, is a biotic environment from which humans take the simple things which they need for survival, of course, and which of course has no meaning to the pre-literate people. So even when they were engaged in these animistic rituals and viewed the world around them as nexus of life. So with this rise of this hierarchy and human dominations, however, the seeds are planted for a belief that nature not only exists as a world apart, but that it is hierarchically organized and can be dominated. So for instance, if we try to like make sense of a magic which reveals this shift pretty much clearly. So the early forms of magic did not view nature as something apart from the world or something which is isolated from the world. So each worldview tended to be such that the practitioner essentially pleaded with the chief spirit. So there is this deep reverence or deep mutual respect which was pretty much seen in this whole exercise, and later there is a dramatic shift in terms of the way in which this magic is being carried out. That is, it becomes entirely instrumental in nature. So therefore there is this deep sense of impositions and the coercive nature of how magic is being carried out. So there is this sense of how why the magic has to be carried out. So it in some sense the shift or changes of the way in which magic is carried out cause a kind of imbalances and pretty much aloof from what it used to be. So therefore there is this notion or mentality of appropriating nature just for the short-term gain or profit by humans. So as I had said that while the earliest form of magic may be regarded as the practice of usually which is non-hierarchical and guided by these principles of egalitarianism, whereas the later forms of this animistic belief in some way betray a more or less hierarchical view of the natural world and of a latent human powers of domination. So this idea of dominating has its primary source in the dominations of human by human, and the structuring of the natural world into a hierarchical chain of being, that is a static conception which incidentally that has no relationship to the evolution of life into increasingly advanced forms of subjectivity and flexibility. So therefore social ecology in some way negates or rather refuse to ignore the fact that the way in which the elitist sections or groups in the society pose, and then the kind of harm which they have done to the natural world was more than in a higher proportion that it has inflicted on humanity. So nor does social ecology overlook the fact that the destiny of human life actually goes hand in hand with the destiny of the non-human world. So this is the very essence of social ecology, or in other words, the ethics of complementarity. So therefore the only way out is that we can only overcome this very notion or ideology of dominating the nature by creating a different forms of society, that is a society which is non-hierarchical, that is which is free of hierarchical structures or economic classes. So therefore, until and unless society is based on economic classes which are conditioned by hierarchy or domination, there can actually be no alternative or no transformations of society vis-a-vis the environment or nature. So therefore, we need to really come out of these clutches, which is strongly advocated and then espoused by social ecology. So how then does this notion of grow or die, that is the survival of the fittest, which is being posited by Darwin, is pretty much relevant over here. So by the same way as hierarchies and class structure tend to become part and parcel of human society, and which of course is very much innate to the modern society, and the market actually has really penetrated deep into not just our social space, but also into the psyche of almost every individual, and market actually began to acquire a life of its own, and which actually reach beyond limited regions in the depths of the vast continents, that is even into the periphery or maybe the hinterland. So market has actually penetrated so much, so deep that we can't really think our social relations beyond this, which is conditioned by the market. So the way in which exchange, for example, the barter economy, like this concept of changing goods for goods, actually ceased to be primarily a means to provide for modest needs, and subverting the limits which is actually being imposed upon it by guilds or by morals and religious restrictions. So therefore, in some way, relations again are being very conditional. It is actually being guided by this mode of exchange, which is actually decided by the market. Now, beginning from the later part of the 18th and the early 19th centuries, we have seen the emergence of the new capitalist class, and with its factory system, and also actually to the commitment to limitless expansion, have actually catered or really led to the expansions of colonizations or colonizing the entire world, and finally even the aspects of most of our personal life. So therefore, unlike what we have seen in, for example, the feudal society or feudal nobility, which has actually a limited boundary, in the sense which is cherished beyond that lands and castles, that is, the bourgeois had no home but the marketplace and the bank walls. So therefore, there is this transition from the feudal society to the industrial society, and the way in which how this capitalist society actually functions and evolve, because their territories and boundaries are limitless. So they can actually move on from one corner of the world to the other. So therefore, one could see that the impact or the way in which how powerful and impactful it is. So as a class, these bourgeois they turned more of the world into an ever expanding domain of factories. So it is limitless. The growth is limitless. So it is ever expanding. Now the industrial capitalists of the modern world actually spawned a very competitive marketplace, and that actually plays high premium on the industrial expansion and the commercial power it conferred, and functions as though growth were an end in itself. So they can't foresee beyond this, that is, to accumulate, to grow, and then to produce a surplus and then profit out of it. So therefore, it is crucially important that in social ecology to sort of recognize or identify the industrial growth, thus that industrial growth does not really result from a change in a cultural outlook alone, and rather from the and the impact of this scientific rationality on society. Rather, all this stems from a harshly objective factors, which is actually being pushed by the expansions of the market itself, that is by that limitless growth which I have already pointed out, and the factors that are largely impervious to these moral considerations and efforts at ethical persuasions. So the very important ideas or key to these principles of the life to survival is expansion and greater profit, so to be invested in still further expansion. So this notion of this progress, once identified by our predecessors as a fate into the evolution of greater human concept, cooperations and care, is now actually being identified by what we in the modern parlance understood as economic growth. Now, one of the main important point social ecology emphasizes is not that moral and spiritual change is meaningless or unnecessary, but then the modern capitalism rather is structurally immoral and hence impervious to any moral aspects. So the aphorisms or maxims like business is business explicitly tell us that ethical, religious, or maybe psychological and emotional factors have absolutely no place in this highly competitive or impersonal world, which is being decided by conditions, and every relations or every kind of interrelationships is based on conditional, and then, for example, profit and growth. So it is grossly misleading to think that we can divest this brutally materialistic and indeed uh, the very notion of this mechanization and mechanistic world which we are into. So therefore, the very notions of like transforming is it that books in some way critically looks and claims that the industrial growth is not really the outcome of a change in the cultural outlook alone, uh, nor it is due to the impact of the scientific rationality. Rather, it stems from the principle of the market itself, that is the demand to grow or die. So it's more of like the survival of the fittest. So or rather the notion of publish or perish, which we normally follow in this the academic domain in this competitive world or this century. So a society which is based on this notion or principles of grow or die as its all pervasive imperative must necessarily have devastating ecological impact, because everyone, there is a cat race competitions of like acquiring for profit, growth, so and so forth. So it is highly mechanistic and guided by this idea of impersonal relationship. So this ever expanding market system that has its roots in one of history's most fundamental social transformation, that is the elaborations of social hierarchy and class into a system of distribution which are again based on exchange rather than complementarity and mutual aid. So one can actually refresh our mind, go back to those traditional societies where this notion of communal ownership, or maybe the idea of how a corporate labor were pretty much the order of the day, and which actually have functioned as the social and economic institutions, which is highly institutionalized. So if you look at the ecological society, that social ecology is not only and appealed by books but it is also in some sense a moral regeneration, and above all it is an attempt for a social reconstruction uh, along the ecological lines. So the one is, it is also important for us to have this to be mindful about the need for a spiritual change, and also and therefore social ecology in some sense seeks to redress the ecological abuses that society has inflicted on the natural world, on the non-human world rather, by going to the structural as well as the subjective sources of notions like the dominations of nature. So social ecology challenges the entire system of domination itself, and also seeks to eliminate the hierarchical and class that has imposed itself on humanity, and defined the relationship between the non-human and human nature. So the boundaries which are drawn between non-human and the human world needs to be redrawn. So social ecology therefore advances this ethics of complementarity, in which human actually plays a supportive role in perpetuating the integrity of the biosphere, as potentially at least that is the most conscious products of natural evolution. And then indeed humans are seen to have a moral responsibility to function in a much more creative or maybe unfolding of that evolutions. So therefore social ecology does stress the need for embodying the ethics of complementarity in palpable social institutions that will enable or give way to meaning to its goals and goals of wholeness, and of how we as a human can involve as a conscious and moral agents in the interplay of species. So in other words, we as a human can become or be part of a responsible or play responsibly. So in conclusion, we can say that in place of this existing hierarchical and class system, which is very much inherent and very much part and parcel of our social system, that class system social ecology actually proposes an egalitarian society which is based on the mutual aid, caring and communitarian values. So in some sense, it tries to espouse what Marx has actually envisioned in terms of this notion of like primitive communism. So in this aspect, a new society would actually emerges, and that would really engage in appreciating the interests of the collective, and which are actually inseparable from those of its individuals. So therefore this new society which is being envisioned actually would be wherein property would be actually shared, which is not individually owned, or the motive is not simply profit or growth, but ideally it will belong to the community as a whole. And in this commune of the communists, that is, property would not belong to the private producers or to a nation state. So therefore this sort of transformation, the shift, actually should be or will be able to be achieved through a radical collective action and a cooperative social movement. So therefore the process of eliminating all dominations must begin not simply in the factory but also in the family, that is within ourselves, within the society, or not only in the economy but also in our thoughts, that is in our psyche, not merely in the material conditions of life but also on the spiritual ones. So therefore there is this an appeal of changing in various levels and various forms, which actually is seen from the works of Bookchin. So Bookchin in some way tries to churn out a kind of like changes or evolutions of not just the human or personal or social, but in every domain or every aspects of our life, from the economic, from the material to the spiritual and to the psyche, and also like to the family, which is where the first form of our social awareness or socializations actually takes place. Bookchin's belief that these oppressive hierarchies which we are being conditioned and then being engaged into, or maybe this inequality, are actually the root of the problems. So therefore there is, if the problem has to be solved, one should nip in the bud, and that only that way a true community can solve the environmental crisis. So these are some of the readings which you can perhaps refer to, and we have in continuations of what we have discussed of Arnin's deep ecology and Gandhian environmentalism, and today's books in social ecology. I am sure that there it will enhance us our notions of how this sense of environmentalism and with regards to environmental philosophy and environmental ethics, the kind of debates which emerges, and then how these philosophers actually takes a stance to to bring out a kind of evolutions or transformations, so that the ecological crisis or environmental problems are being solved or sought out, and that would bring an alternative or a new forms of society. Thank you.